Okay, everyone, welcome to AI in Veterinary Medicine podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of having Dr. Adam Little. Dr. Adam, thank you for being here. How are you?
Good, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
So, I spoke with Dr. Adam a couple of weeks ago because somebody referred me to him, and his journey is actually very, very cool. Dr. Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you started to get into veterinary medicine, and yeah, how did you start in this, and then let's.
Happy to. While I think I've ended up in a non-traditional kind of spot in my career, um, I didn't necessarily intend to go that route when I was in. I attended the University of Guelph, and much like every other person who was trying to get into veterinary school there, a lot of volunteering, a lot of time being spent in practices, and originally I was kind of drawn to the fields of neurology and oncology. And it was only really in vet school that I began to maybe be exposed to some of the broader ways in which veterinary medicine could help the world, and in particular, some of the opportunities that were emerging for technology to play a role in helping to accelerate that. When I was in first year, I had the opportunity to go to Tanzania with Veterinarians Without Borders, and my involvement in that organization certainly shaped a part of my journey really focused on kind of international development and food security and food safety that took me through a bunch of other opportunities. But alongside that was when some of the first literature was coming out. I remember the bear animal usage study, and this would have been in like 2009, I guess, 2010. That was sort of looking at the impact that the internet was having on veterinary medicine, and in particular, how clients were accessing services and their expectations. And we began to see, I think, the first real wave of solutions that were coming out for practices. And from my perspective, and this has kind of been maybe one of the things that's been unchanged in my career over the last decade or so, I've always believed that if I could create or help to create systems that enabled more veterinarians to practice at a higher level to see more patients, then for me, that would be a way for me to really amplify my impact. And it turned out that I really liked working on those problems. And that kind of took me on this technology journey, which is
That is,
yeah.
yeah,
So that's a little bit of the background there.
that is so interesting. And the first time that you told me that you went to Tanzania and to Africa, I was like, wow, like, is this a common thing, or like, did you have like a big opportunity here, or like, were you selected, or like, like,
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's necessarily common in that everybody does it, but I wouldn't also say like it isn't. There's a lot of programs that are at different veterinary institutions that really actually try to encourage students to go to seek out other opportunities to apply
that's
their veterinary interest and skill set. Our program, Veterinarians Without Borders, selected, I believe, something like 18 or 20 students from the different veterinary colleges across Canada, of
nice.
which there are five, and so. What was kind of neat about that particular program, unlike maybe some of the other ones, is that we were kind of placed in different areas with different people. And so Tanzania ended up being kind of this beautiful place that I was kind of randomly put into in a project with poultry farmers and a colleague from the western part of Canada called Monica. And so it was this kind of really 3 months intense process, but we it wasn't like, hey, I went into this program say I want to go to Tanzania, I want to do poultry farmers. I know Monica. It's like we were just kind of that was kind of where the need was, and I ended up going back several times over the course of the first
Wow.
part of my career, and yeah, really eye opening, and certainly I think gave me an appreciation for the
Hmm.
variety of ways in which people can use their veterinary background, and the ways in which that can serve maybe society beyond just the clinic walls.
Just the clinic was, yeah. No, that's awesome. And so, and you mentioned that, it was around 2009 when you were first starting to see about, the advent of like internet in veterinary medicine. Like, I
Yeah.
have two questions there. I think the first question is 2009, like, is that like a little bit far since the internet started? Like
Yeah.
why in 2009? Like, why did you think it took so long for veterinary medicine to, like, is there something in there, or yeah?
So I lost there for a second. I think your question was like, why did it? So maybe to caveat this, I think the internet was probably having a lot. larger of an impact long before I kind of came across that particular paper. But I think it was maybe more that the industry started to take things a little bit more seriously. And the way that I kind of think about it is we go through these bundling and unbundling phases when it comes to veterinary software. And so, when you look at when you look at kind of the evolution of a lot of these hospital systems, in the beginning, it was like pen and paper. You went in, you did your work, you kind of knew what was happening. There wasn't really a ton of other,
Right.
there wasn't any apps or software things to worry about. And then we saw the creation of these first kind of practice management software systems that were really, technology that was designed to help practices run kind of the back office, right? Things like managing their inventory and connecting to diagnostics and sort of all those pieces. And I think around that time, you started to see kind of this first wave of unbundling where there was a bunch of capabilities that started becoming really important for practices that were much more in the front end of the veterinary experience as opposed to the back end. So things like, how do we communicate with our clients? How do we make it so that they can book appointments? How do we share medical records? How do we do a bunch of things that weren't really problems that anybody kind of needed solutions to? And the systems at that time were not necessarily well equipped to be able to handle those needs. And so what ended up happening is there was this kind of boom of startups and companies that were really point solutions that were kind of taking parts of what people might traditionally think of being like one piece of software and running with it. And you sort of saw the wave of things like Allied DVM and Vet2Pet and VitusVet and GoFetch to a certain extent, but even companies really Pet Desk, et cetera. And so there was a variety of companies that got started. Many didn't kind of end up making it, but you saw kind of that unbundling occur. And I think we're in this period now where that's now shifted to more of like bundling it back in. And so a lot of the newer practice management software systems are either trying to integrate or frankly build those capabilities directly into the operating system. And I think that's what you're beginning to see. We'll talk about AI in a second, but the creation of systems that are now trying to manage more holistically the needs of the practice as opposed to maybe relying on these other tools. But there's like over 100 of those tools now. And so that period was really fascinating in part because I think for a lot of people, there was a lot of veterinary founders, Stacey Sadu with Vet2Pet, Mark with VitusVet and others who I think were really drawn to solving problems that they themselves experienced. And that gave them kind of a unique perspective and motivation that led to some really important technology. And so even if there was individual companies who didn't ultimately achieve the success they would hope, they still advanced the field quite considerably. And I think exposed people, clients and veterinarians at that time to the power that technology could bring to a practice in a way that wasn't really common before.
Right. To the sort of opportunities that you could build with this thing. And I honestly think the same is happening with AI. We'll talk about it in a second, but there's a lot of companies, including our company, that it's trying to make a mark in here. But more and more and more, you see more companies understanding that this is a possibility and then giving it a twist or doing the same idea or different idea, but like now this is more possible and AI is helping veterinary medicine and whatnot. And so I think it's the same lines, just with the newer technology. And so, before we talk about AI, you just briefly mentioned it, but I wanted to you spend a little bit of time talking about GoFetch. So is this,
Yeah.
after you read this paper and after found these opportunities, like was this one of the reasons why you started GoFetch, and like how was that process?
Yeah.
Where did you
I,
start?
I,
Yeah.
yeah. Ironically enough, I think the vision behind GoFetch and like the problem that is probably the most consistent kind of element of my career. I feel like I've been in one way or another trying to create that next model of care for a very long time, and GoFetch was obviously the most kind of concentrated um, attempt at that. But after I read that paper, like I started building mock-ups for an app that I called Pet Connect, and I literally was in vet school meeting with different advisors and folks who I felt could add could provide feedback or guidance on this, like literally like napkin sketch. And a lot of those ideas that went into that prototype were things that I think today are still really important, right? How do you help people more easily connect with a veterinarian? How do you allow them to have better information going into the visit? How do you allow them to kind of manage their pet's care more easily on their own devices, whether that's like refilling medications or kind of managing that. And I think um, kind of at a very fundamental level, those problems and that kind of need to build a care model that, for me, really did empower the individual relationship that people had with their veterinarians that I still think is particularly like important. And so while, I'm happy to talk to the cows come home about some of the reasons, it struggles and maybe isn't better yet. I think that there's a lot of resilience in that relationship. And for me, if you can really tap into the things that make that a really positive experience, the connection people have, the trust, the data, the infrastructure to provide care, but take work off of the clinic's plate, I think that you can allow them to practice at a level that not only is more efficient and more leads to better patient outcomes, but frankly is more enjoyable. And so the vision with GoFetch was, could we build a care model that we could offer through practices? It was like a subscription care model where we could say, look, we want every person who enrolls their pet and every pet that comes in to be like your best client and your best visit. And the way that we're going to do that is that we're going to ensure that they have a baseline level of care through this subscription model. We're going to empower them with better information ahead of these visits so that when they're coming in, they kind of know what to expect and how much it's going to cost.
Mm.
And then we're going to use incentives and financing as a way to like reward really good behaviors and compliance, and at the same time provide a safety net for things that might be outside the scope of, or unexpected. And I think there's a lot of aspects of that platform that would probably resonate even today with like the audience. But for us practically, that was kind of building like four companies in one. And it was really difficult to make all those pieces work in a way that you're bringing this to a kind of legacy network of clinics that has different hospital systems. And so we kind of get the tale of two cities in some cases. When it worked, it felt like a magical experience and we got some great feedback around that. But when it didn't work, it was disruptive enough that it was difficult then for the clinic to really buy into that model. And it was a big change for practices. And so we were asking a lot in terms of their investment of time and energy to make it work. And ultimately, when you're kind of in a position where you have to grow really quickly, that kind of clinic acquisition costs and the need to change the workflows and integrate with the practices just added a level of effort that unfortunately for us made it that the business wasn't able to succeed in the way that we would have hoped.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think there's so many good things that you mentioned about this past 2 minutes, but that last one about you're trying to innovate, you're trying to build something fast, you're trying to grow fast, and the last thing you want to do is ask too much of like the user, ask too much
Yeah,
of the clinic or of the veterinarian, and you have to build that product in such a seamless way that it's 2 clicks, 3 clicks, 4 clicks, but then the experience is done. It really saves you time. And piggybacking on what you were saying at the beginning, which is how can you make the job more enjoyable? I actually like
yeah,
that thing. We've all been thinking about more efficiency, and you can see more clients, and there's less stress, less burnout, paperwork, for example, with the AI scribes. But like the reality is, like if it's more enjoyable,
yeah.
then there's better care automatically because you're happier to go to work and you're happier to treat this pet and provide the care.
It's interesting, and I was having this conversation with a colleague, and maybe this is a pretty direct way of saying it, but like there's a lot of people who are happier in vet medicine by practicing less vet medicine. And people that are kind of optimizing in part because of how much other crap there is around the experience that makes their lives difficult.
Yeah.
And I think that there's an opportunity, and I would also say that I think there's a lot of veterinary teams that have been disappointed or let down by software that was supposed to make their lives easier. And
Yeah.
like, we had that, right? Like, I'm not going to pretend that,
Yeah.
we didn't run into that ourselves. And so I feel like at times veterinarians have been labeled as, laggards or people that aren't, willing to adopt these things. And I think for a lot of people, there's just been a lack of understanding of the job and what it entails. And then these complexities that might be very warranted from a technical perspective. Hey, we can't integrate with your systems like that. We can't give you this information in this way. But if you're the user of that software, you're kind of like, I don't really care about the reasons you think it's hard. I'm just saying what you're creating for me isn't valuable enough. And either you fix it or you don't, but I'm not going to be able to work with this. And I think what's really interesting now about AI, you're beginning to see some of this, is the ability to move software down from this thing that like helps the business to something that really helps the individual. And I think with a lot of these dictation apps, as an example, it's the ability to create value for a user that in many cases is the most highly paid, most labor intensive kind of individual. So in a way that doesn't require the permission of other people. It doesn't require every vet to be on board. It doesn't require, in some cases, the hospital systems to talk to each other. And I think that's unlocking this kind of new paradigm of software where if you can create value for the individual vet without requiring all these other pieces to work in a way that aligns with your business, it unlocks a bunch of use cases that are really interesting, but also I think really meaningful and valuable for veterinarians because they're no longer this afterthought. They are the user, and you basically shrunk all this middle ground as a company between you and the people that are actually using your software. So I think that is kind of what I really like that because it's in some ways more the antithesis than of like the traditional like hospital procurement process, which I think a lot of hospitals now have boomerang back to as you've seen the consolidation. Now you can't really talk to the owner who's like the decision maker, the user, the person who's going to train the team. You're talking to 4 or 5 layers of management, people that have different, responsibilities, and I can get why those people are and those processes are important. But as a company, it means that you're not really pitching the customer or the user, and that lack of kind of connectivity to that
Yeah.
feedback and to that relationship, I think really stunts software development personally.
Yeah. Yeah. No, precisely. Precisely. I really like how you put it. I really like how you put it. Look, Dr. Adam, I know we're almost done here, but I wanted to ask you a couple more questions. You seem to know quite a bit about this, and you mentioned about the efficiencies and stuff like the dictation softwares and the AI scribe.
Yeah,
But if we move past that, you
yeah,
having been a veterinarian, where do you think the most impact of AI is going to be? Because the technology is going to get better and better and better. But like
yeah,
I've heard that AI scribes are great, but image diagnostics is where it's really gonna come in. And image
yeah,
diagnostics has already existed, by the way, but
yeah,
some people are claiming that it's gonna get even better. Or
yeah.
preventative care. Can we detect before something happens to a dog, to a cat? Like, where do you think big AI advancements are probably gonna be there in the next 5 years for veterinary medicine?
Yeah, like I think one of the thought exercises that I sometimes like to do is I look at something like bloodletting as an example, and it's like at some point in the journey of veterinary medicine, like that was considered acceptable practice, and we look back now in like horror of like how did we ever do this? And so I really like to zoom out and feel like what are the things that we're doing now that will look insane in 50 or 100 years about the way that we practice? And I think that there's a couple of big ones, and then I think that there's a bunch of like really interesting kind of in the near term pieces. So I think the first one is like the field of veterinary research more broadly is going to be completely transformed, right? We're going to be able to unlock the historical data that we have on patients that remember when it was pen and paper, like you can track it, you can use it, et cetera. And so there's going to be a lot of information that we might not really be able to tap into, but you
Yeah.
have at any given day, tens of thousands of appointments that are happening. And the way that we provide care today is still relatively generic. And I think that when you look at even veterinary research in terms of like the amount of output, how do we do recruitment? How do we focus things? Most papers are like on groups of beagles, right? Like there isn't like this like crowdsourced ability to be able to say, okay, here's all the genetic footprint of all these patients. We're going to proactively kind of look and track them or more effortlessly connect them to research protocols or use AI to help us understand even the questions that we should be asking. And so I think that's really going to unlock the development of some new therapies. So I think that's one piece. I think the second part is we're going to need a care model that frankly can absorb the advancements of veterinary medicine. And what I mean by that is as we move towards, being able to do better cancer diagnostics or being able to do, more advanced therapies. If we have a world in which that's only available to a very, very, very small portion of pet owners at the expense of 30 or 40% of pet owners who basically get no veterinary care whatsoever, I
Yeah.
think that we're going to be in a position where we are creating advancements that are basically um, unattainable to the vast majority of pet owners. And I think that friction is really tough because if you're a veterinarian and you have the tools to help something, but for a bunch of reasons you can't, that's what I think is one of the challenges around burnout and that sort of pieces. I think when you start to look at the ways in which these AI systems will be integrated within the tools that you're using, it's not going to be this chat box on another website. It's going to be as you are working, these
Yeah.
assistants are actually kind of course correcting you. And that course correction can be everything to like, hey, you don't, I wouldn't use this drug in this case, or this amount of this dosing is not necessarily appropriate, all the way to like have you consider these other pieces, all the
Yeah.
way to things like, hey, I can tell by the dictation that you are struggling with this case, or that the client was really angry. And like, let's talk about something not necessarily even medical, but
Yeah. Yeah.
rather kind of like, and so I think that this ability for doctors, in the same way that I think humans will increasingly talk and interact with AIs, to use that as a way that increases the surface area for support, where it's not just like these medical diagnostics and diagnosing, but rather the broader experience of being a veterinarian, I think is really, really powerful, making you practice like you feel like you're not alone.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that in the very short term, this is where things I think get really interesting, is that as you remove the friction to receive that support. And so the way that I do, and again, like I zoom out a little bit, right? But like if I, hundreds of years ago, if like I needed an answer to a question, like I might like, I used to like hop in a boat, go for years, ask some questions and come back. A bunch of people would die, get a whole bunch of diseases. It was terrible. Then we had like these centralized places of knowledges, universities, libraries, but I'd still have to like go find them, not very available, etc. Then those resources kind of got democratized. And then we had these computers where I could like go to a place that was pretty close by, or even in my house, ask a question on the internet, come back. And now we have phones and yada, yada, yada. But you've gone from what used to be like years to get pretty brittle answers that were only available to a certain amount of people, to now literally within seconds, I can
Yeah.
get answers to most questions. And as you start to look at how the voice models evolve and how these AI tools get integrated, you're not even going to have to ask the question. It's
Mm.
prompting you and it's understanding your needs. And I've been
Mm.
using some of the new like Mac apps, Mac ChatGPT and pieces like that. And even going from like it's on a browser to like it's a keyboard shortcut that you're just talking to now. It's amazing to see how my own personal use has increased and the value that I'm getting from these tools. And so I think that when you start to look at, well, when I need help, I just have to think it and I can get that support. And I'm able to then empower my own abilities to provide care. I think that
Mm.
gets really, really special. And then I think the last thing I'll make a note of is I expect that there will be a lot of these like more controversial cases of how AI, whether it's like, we talk like diagnosing the patient, et cetera, that I think people will say the stakes are very high.
Yes.
Um, but I think that people really ignore just like the value that's created from the tools
Yeah.
today for kind of the,
Yeah.
the, the things where the stakes might not be that high. The friction around responding to an angry client or summarizing a medical record, when you get, it 5 minutes before an exam. And I think that there's just so many use cases where the tools today can be incredibly helpful and don't really even touch this like existential, what if the computer's wrong and the black box spits out an answer. I think the other thing is that the, the whole the whole education process of veterinary medicine is around like working and understanding information so that you can make the best decision. And
Mm.
so I think more highly of vets. I think that if an AI is just spitting out answers that are wrong, I don't think that AI is going to be around very long. It's going to be improved. But also, that's like saying, I read something stupid on the internet and I go and do it. And I
Yeah.
think the reality is that veterinarians are incredibly empathetic. They're dealing with a lot of different factors. And this
Yeah.
is one piece of information that for them might cause them to question, hey, I hadn't considered that diagnosis, or I hadn't considered that piece. And then what gets really interesting is when you're able to interact with these systems to be like, help me explain
Yeah.
to me why you arrived at that answer. So this idea that like we're just spitting out answers, vets are blindly taking them and then like resulting in malpractice or worse patient outcomes. There might be, I'm not saying there won't be situations where that doesn't happen, but I
Right.
just don't think that's where this progresses. And I think the vast majority of veterinarians will benefit significantly from
Yeah.
just some of the basic kind of blocking, tackling of effectively like non-medical or somewhat medical, administrative support, more so than like, here's this like incredibly difficult case and I just need to put all the information in and it spits out a one-word answer.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
think what's going to happen is that, a lot of the activities in care kind of just shifts downward. Specialty care, and that expertise can be available to general practitioners. Some of the things that general practitioners do can be available to other team members or maybe even pet owners directly. And that's going to free up these kind of higher level thinking, in theory, that some of the top, minds in the veterinary medicine can provide. And I think that gets really exciting at a time when people have never been closer and have never spent more money.
Yeah.
things like pet longevity, things like actually curing some of these illnesses. And I think there's going to be things that I learned about in veterinary medicine that used to be either death sentences or, really challenging diagnoses. My own dog got degenerative myelopathy, and it was awful, right? He was mentally fine. He lost the ability, and we could see the progression such that, he went from he's uncomfortable, he's not very mobile, to like, unfortunately, he's at a point where euthanasia is kind of the option. But seeing that was awful. And if we can even make a little bit of a dent in some of those types of illnesses, I think it's going to really transform what veterinarians can do. And I hope that people look at the potential of these tools and the ability for us to shape how they're used,
Mm.
and the ability to create value for ourselves, even at a time when maybe your colleagues or your organization or even your hospital might be a little bit behind, or maybe unwilling to try some of this stuff out. So a big part of like what I do now is like, how can I get the tools that are already available in the hands of more veterinarians so that A, they can create value, but B, we can understand like what should we build next.
Right. Right. What a great way to end it. What a great way to summarize it. Thank you so, so much, Dr. Adam. This is great, great insight, and I agree with you in terms of how AI can help in the future. So hopefully we make a dent.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much for
Kevin.
being here. I
Yeah,
appreciate you.
appreciate it. Cheers.
Bye, Dr. Adam.